Should know this.
Differences, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Dean. Thanks, everyone. Oh, sorry. Were you going to
I was just
introduce
going to
me?
say the usual stuff, but you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm this guy. And I'm going to give this talk. Thanks, Dean. Thanks, everyone. So can I, work the clicker and buzzes when you press it. So here are some notable features of this talk. First of all, it's going to be a work in progress. It's not even half-baked. It's a quarter-baked at best. So especially the proposed answer. So I'm going to raise a question and then I'm going to sort of gesture in the direction of some kind of answer to it. The answer I don't think is any good yet. I hope I've at least got an interesting question to raise, to think about. So we'll see. So please be gentle on account of the fact that it's a work in progress. I'm really looking for feedback too because I'm branching out. In fact, I'm pleased to announce this is going to be my first academic talk in over 10 years without the word psychedelic in the title. So I've been very kind of, single-minded for the last decade or so. I did my PhD on psychedelics and I'm only now starting to sort of try and branch out. So on the one hand, please be understanding, but on the other hand, I'm really aware that I'm starting to talk and think about topics about which a lot has been written, and I haven't read nearly as much of it as I should have, so I'm really interested in not just your own ideas, but any comments you have along the lines of, Chris, you clearly haven't read X and you need to. These are things I would like to know. The third point is that this is probably going to be the most depressing and miserable talk of the whole conference because the variety of nothingness I'm going to talk about is not one of these sort of uplifting, mystical oneness as God, universal mind underlying the universe, but instead it's the kind of existential dread that we have when we contemplate our own inevitable annihilation, the nothingness that we imagine ourselves disappearing into at the moment of our inevitable death. So hopefully the people who are speaking this afternoon can say something to bring to raise your spirits after this. So the talk is in three parts. All my talks are in three parts. In the first part, I'm going to introduce the phenomenon that I'm thinking about. In the second part, I'm going to raise the question. I'm going to raise a few different questions about this phenomenon and zero in on the one that I'm trying to think about. And then in part three, it's going to get really messy when I start looking at some possible answers. And in fact, I realized in the last few days that I don't think the answer, the rough, sketchy answer I've come up with, I'm not even convinced it's an answer to the question I'm asking. So the whole thing is a disaster, but hopefully by the time that we get to doing the edited book, I'll have lots of great feedback to make it less disastrous. So, the phenomenon. The phenomenon is one that, as I said, a lot has been written about, and Thomas Nagel calls it the expectation of nothingness. And this is a phrase that's been picked up in the last 10 years or so by the philosopher James Bailey. And the way Bailey describes it is by saying that, while all psychologically competent persons know that they will one day die, it seems that at times we can come to know that we will die in a distinctive way, a way that's relatively rare and that is far more vivid and emotion-inducing than the ordinary, banal, mundane way in which we all presently know that we will die.
What's a psychologically competent person?
That's a good question. I'm going to treat it for now as something like a person without a mental illness or something like that. Don't ask me what a mental illness is.
It's a person that knows that they will one day die.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks, Ruben. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. We can just say, almost everyone. I think that will do the job just as well. So, sometimes it seems that we can come to know of our own mortality, not just theoretically or intellectually or reflectively, but in our bones. And the poet Philip Larkin talks about a special way of being afraid no trick dispels. And as I said, Thomas Nagel talks about the expectation of nothingness. So here's the original passage. I'm going to have quite a few lengthy direct quotes in this first section, so apologies for that. I hope it doesn't wear too thin, but they're good quotes from people who can articulate this stuff better than I can. So here's Nagel, 1986. It might seem that there could be no form of thought about your own death except either an external view in which the world is pictured as continuing after your life stops, or an internal view that sees only this side of death, that includes only the finitude of your expected future consciousness. But this is not true. There is also something that can be called the expectation of nothingness. And though the mind tends to veer away from it, it is an unmistakable experience, always startling, often frightening, and very different from the familiar recognition that your life will go on for only a limited time. The emphasis is mine, of course, the bits in bold are bits that I think are important. The positive prospect of the end of subjective time, though it is logically inseparable from these limits, is something distinct. What is the specific object of this feeling? In part, it's the idea of the objective world and objective time continuing without me in it, but the special feeling I'm talking about does not depend only on this. It is the prospect of nothingness itself, not the prospect that the world will go on after I cease to exist, that has to be understood. So there's something here about the idea that we grasp that I will become nothing or will cease to exist, that is distinct from these other sort of relatively mundane facts, that the world will continue without me and that my future existence is finite. There's something about my own non-existence, according to Nagel, that is the peculiar object of this specific experience he's talking about. So to really make sure we've got a fix on the phenomenon, I've got two more descriptions. So here's James Bailey, who's been writing about this recently. Here's his own description of his experience of the expectation of nothingness. And then after this, I've got a contrast that Bailey draws between a description of what he takes to be the expectation of nothingness as opposed to a more mundane instance of being aware of mortality. So here's Bailey's expectation of nothingness. Last night I entered into a state of mind unlike anything I had experienced before. I realized that I will die. It may be tomorrow, it may be in 50 years' time, but one way or another it is inevitable and utterly non-negotiable. I no longer just knew this theoretically, but knew it in my bones. The knowledge of my death was real to me as if for the first time, in a way that it no longer is as I write these words. It was as if I had been given a glimpse of an aspect of reality that had previously been closed to me. It was as if the blinders had been removed and I was the only person to have woken up from a collective dream to grasp the terror of the situation. Interesting echoes of certain Buddhist scriptures there, actually. It was to be defenseless against this fact and without the possibility of defense. This new awareness was completely out of my control. I have no idea how it came about. All attempts to turn my attention to other matters failed completely. I could only wait, traumatized in the hope that it would pass. I was in this state for the longest 10 minutes of my life. So, hopefully by now you begin to see why I started with the content warning of sorts. Now I'm curious, you don't have to, but is anyone willing to volunteer that they themselves have had an experience of this kind? I'm going to start by doing so. This is why I'm interested in this, right? Okay, a few, 3 or 4 people in the room maybe. Thanks for sharing. Yeah.
I've never seen words like that before, and I've had exactly that. But mine was, I think, 2 to 3 weeks long. Not continuous like that, but 2 to 3 heavy weeks.
See, I've been having a really interesting experience over the last 1 or 2 years, which I take to be due to my meditation practice. And if you can imagine there being a scale from 1 to 10 of how vivid your awareness of this can be, and like, let's say this sort of description is a 9 or a 10 or something, it's almost like my default level of it has gone up from a 1 or a 2 up to a 3 or a 4, with occasional, every few days a spike up to a 5 or 6 or 7 or something.
I just want to point out while it's there, Robert Sapolsky, Stanford biologist, so I've read his lectures online or in his book Behave, describes it almost identically that way. He suddenly says, you don't understand, we're all going to die. He's kind of wondering why everybody's just acting normal.
Good. All right, so I'm going to be taking notes on all these pointers. So Robert Sapolsky has a description. Thanks.
I can text you it.
Yeah, please. That'll do for now. All right. So there you go, and I'm glad that a few of you were willing to say that, because one of the things that Bailey talks about is people are sometimes skeptical about the existence, the reality of this phenomenon, and I think there are enough converging descriptions of it across philosophy and literature and so on to think that while this isn't something that everyone experiences, it is a specific, distinct, robust phenomenon that needs to be understood and reckoned with. And so here's the contrast that Bailey draws. He says, in the memoir of the novelist Julian Barnes, you get 2 distinct descriptions, one of which is of relatively mundane awareness of mortality, and another of which is of the expectation of nothingness. And it's quite interesting, even the relatively mundane one sounds a little bit grim, right? So Barnes says, for me, death is the one appalling fact which defines life. Unless you are constantly aware of it, you cannot begin to understand what life is about. Unless you know and feel that the days of wine and roses are limited, that the wine will... Anyone know how to pronounce that? Madeirais? Madeirais? Thank you. Madeirais, okay. And the roses turn brown in their stinking water before all are thrown out forever, including the jug. There is no context to such pleasures and interests as come your way on the road to the grave. So that still sounds, fairly bleak and fairly kind of, miserable in a way. But it has this characteristic that I think sets, other kinds of awareness of mortality aside from the expectation of nothingness, which is the sense that this is something that you can respond to in some meaningful way. There's something you can do about this, that some way of responding to this that makes sense. Whereas what seems to be characteristic of the expectation of nothingness is that this is a complete, unmitigated disaster. There's no response you could possibly have to this fact that would, make the situation better in any way. And so here's Barnes's expectation of nothingness, according to Bailey. Only a couple of nights ago, there came again that alarmed and alarming moment of being pitchforked back into consciousness, awake, alone, utterly alone, beating pillow with fist and shouting, "Oh no, oh no, oh no," in an endless wail, the horror of the moment, the minutes, overwhelming what might to an objective witness appear a shocking display of exhibitionist self-pity. An inarticulate one too, for what sometimes shames me is the extraordinary lack of descriptive or responsive words that come out of my mouth. We know that extreme physical pain drives out language. It is dispiriting to learn that mental pain does the same. So I tend to agree with Bailey in thinking that this is a qualitatively distinct type of experience from the first one, and that's where a lot of the kind of theoretical and philosophical puzzles about this phenomenon arise, is what in relation to thinking about what exactly is the difference between these kinds of states and how it can come about. So, as I said, not everyone has experienced the expectation of nothingness, but there are enough independent descriptions that seem to converge on core features of it that I think it's reasonable to take it seriously, to regard it as a robust, real phenomenon. And the abstract structure of it is quite familiar too, right? So if we cast our awareness out beyond death and mortality, this general structure of there being something that we can know on an intellectual, a merely intellectual or reflective or propositional level, that we can then come to know in our bones, or to know in this, deeper, more vivid way. Well, we come across it all over the place, right? So probably the most talked about example in philosophy is Frank Jackson's example of Mary, the thought experiment about Mary's room. Anyone not familiar with Mary in the black and white room? Okay, yeah, quite a few of you. All right, so it's a thought experiment to do with phenomenal consciousness, conscious experience, and the metaphysics of mind. And the basic idea is Mary, in the distant future, when neuroscience is complete, we've learned everything there is to know about how the human brain and body works. Mary is raised in a black and white room, and for the entirety of her life, she never sees anything that has colour. She learns the entirety of neuroscience, with a particular focus on the neurophysiology of colour vision. So she learns everything there is to know in an objective, third-person, scientific way about what happens in someone's body and brain when they see something red. And then on one fateful day, which is the kind of pivotal point of the thought experiment, Mary is released from her black and white room and she sees something red for the first time. And the point that the thought experiment is supposed to make is actually that physicalism is false. There's something more to consciousness, more to the mind than the merely physical, because the argument goes, Mary knew everything physical that there was to know about seeing red, and yet she still learned something new when she was released from her room. So it can't be the case that the physical is all there is to know about conscious experience. But yeah, I mean, the argument against physicalism isn't the main concern here. The point is it's got this same structure. So in some sense, pre-release Mary knows a whole lot about seeing red in a way that is somehow merely theoretical or indirect or something like this, and then on release she comes to know about seeing red in a way that is more vivid, more real, I'm not saying that all these cases necessarily are exactly the same when you get down to the details, but you also have Tamar Gendler, the philosopher, who draws a distinction between A-leaf and B-leaf, right? And she says, you know, sometimes we might believe a certain thing and yet we A-leave its negation. So she introduces the idea of an A-leaf as a kind of mental state that is sort of like a belief but different from it. It's lower level, it's more sort of impervious to reason and evidence. It's got more to do with kind of perception and affect and behaviour rather than our explicit sort of reflective convictions. And the example that she has a couple, but one of them is the Grand Canyon Skywalk. So this, you know, marvel of engineering, this transparent sort of thing that goes out over the Grand Canyon. And of course you can look into everything about how many people walk out on it every day and don't fall, and how kind of incredibly well it's been engineered. And so you can have a very strong, well-founded belief that the Grand Canyon Skywalk is safe, that you're not going to fall through it. And yet, you know, despite this belief, you might find yourself struggling to actually walk out onto it. You might sort of inch your way out, trembling and sweating and so on. And well, the question is, why are you doing that if you believe that it's safe? And Gendler's answer is, well, while you believe that it's safe, you A-leave that it's unsafe, you know? On this deeper level below explicit conscious belief, you have some complex of mental states that actually says the opposite, it's unsafe.
I actually flew over the Monte Grosso in a little light aircraft when I was quite scared, and I wondered why I was terrified, because really normally I wasn't. And I realised if the plane went down, the canopy would part and then come together again, and I'd be in a forest the size of Western Europe. And I thought, what if, you know? And I think at that moment I did really think, actually, you know, this might be it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a different kind of case, because it sounds like you did really, on the level of explicit conscious reflection, have the belief that I may well die now.
Yeah, and but I did think maybe it's this is it totally. You know, even though I do believe in God and consciousness and so on, you know, these thoughts must come into your head, because to counter, in a sense, your belief. Right? So they challenge each your beliefs will challenge the nullity, right? And the nullity will challenge the belief. And I think this, you find this in the work of Mark Rothko, the artist.
Okay.
Where every level of paint is an expression of possibly anger at those people who deny the possibility of death.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you see some of his works, these are very large works. There's a brutalism to them, and I think the brutalism is to portray the brutality of the actual death, the nothing, the total it, gone. No.
That sounds good, and the idea of a visual sort of artistic representation of that is interestingly relevant to what I'm going to end up talking about. Is that Rothko?
K-E.
K-E, Rothko.
Oh, I think
Rothko.
it's
Rothko, yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks, I'll look it up.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
It's worth it.
All right, good. Yeah, so this is the general kind of thing I'm talking about. Happens all over the place. We believe one thing about how the world is, and yet we experience the world as being different. And my friend and colleague Miri Al-Bahari has a good paper on this kind of thing too, where she talks about, you know, a hypothetical expert on Buddhism who knows everything there is to know intellectually about the doctrine of no self, but still experiences herself as a self. And so Miri's question is, you know, analogous, of course, to Frank Jackson's question about Mary in the black and white room. What happens to Mary Analog, the expert on the no-self doctrine, on the day when she finally attains insight knowledge, you know, this kind of direct, meditative, experiential knowledge of no-self? And here it is in the words of George Eliot, who I just love to quote all over the place. She talks about, and this is actually in relation to someone coming to grasp their own mortality in a new and more vivid way. And Eliot describes it as one of those rare moments of experience when we feel the truth of a commonplace, which is as different from what we call knowing it as the vision of waters upon the earth is different from the delirious vision of the water which cannot be had to cool the burning tongue. So that's from Middlemarch. So this is the kind of thing I'm on about. So hopefully we've got a good sense of the phenomenon now. Now, what are the questions one might ask about it, and in particular the question I want to ask about it? So the broadest possible question about the expectation of nothingness is what's going on here, right? How can this happen? And in particular, how can we sort of believe that we're going to die while not believing that we're going to die? And the questions that Bailey has been asking about it in recent years, picking up on the work of Nagel, are, first of all, he's got 2 papers on it. And the first one is, how can I be shocked by what I already know? And that sounds, you know, more or less like a psychological question, like a question about the sort of mechanisms at play. And the second question is more straightforwardly epistemological. You know, how can I discover something that I already knew? It seems that there is something that we learn in the experience of the expectation of nothingness, and given that we already know we're going to die, what can it be that we learn? What's the new knowledge that we gain? Now, these questions intersect with matters of theoretical psychology, especially the first one, but still I think their primary bent is epistemological, phenomenological maybe. It's about knowledge and it's about what the experience is like. So the question I want to ask, which I don't think has yet been answered satisfactorily, is more straightforwardly not just psychological, but representational, cognitive. And so this is where my own kind of background and, you know, theoretical and methodological commitments start coming into play. So I want to ask something like, on the one hand, what is the representational content of the expectation of nothingness, of this specific experience? And then a bit more broadly, what cognitive or computational processes explain this type of experience, this distinctive phenomenology that's being described by Nagel and Bailey and co. And so obviously I'm assuming that experiences are to be explained by describing cognitive and computational processes. So that's one of my sort of assumptions in this area, and I'll say more about that in a moment. So I'm first going to unpack the assumptions that underlie this question and then try and develop it from a question into a puzzle, and show that if you buy into certain plausible assumptions, it should be not just interesting but puzzling to wonder how this can be the case and what sorts of computational processes are at play here. So, that's the wrong way. Here's all my kind of philosophical commitments in one slide. So I accept a generic physicalism or materialism about the mind. I don't know if this puts me in a minority at this conference, but I don't even know how essential that is to the puzzle I'm going to develop here. I mean, most people who think about the mind in the kinds of ways that I do tend to be physicalists or materialists, but I don't know if that's essential. The more heavy-duty stuff that is really doing the lifting in this area is that I accept a broad version of representationalism about phenomenal consciousness. So this is the idea that conscious experience, you know, the what it's likeness of subjective experience, is thoroughly determined by the contents of mental representations. So what do I mean by mental representation? This is, in the first instance, a theoretical construct of cognitive science. So what distinguishes cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, cognitive psychology from other approaches to the mind, at least on a traditional way of conceiving it, is that they say the mind is a representational system. The human mind, and probably other minds too, operate by generating, creating, manipulating these inner states that we call representations, and the generation and manipulation of mental representations by the mind is what explains the intelligent behavior of humans and other organisms. So there's a lot of different theories about what exactly a representation is, what a mental representation is. I'm using it in a fairly generic but still quite specific sense as an internal state of the system that serves as a proxy for something and has the function of guiding the system's behaviour with respect to that thing. So this is, for people who know the philosophy of cognitive science and the philosophy of mind, this is the conception of mental representation as a stand-in, basically. So it sounds a little bit complicated, but it's not really. The idea is, you know, outside the organism, there are all these things, tables, water bottles, whatever. The brain in here has the job of moving the organism through the world to attain its goals, you know, towards nutrients and mates, away from threats and, you know, destruction and so on. And how can the brain do that in relation to these distal objects? Well, the senses are receiving all this stimulation, you know, through the different sensory modalities. And the idea is the brain then internally constructs these states, generates these, you know, patterns of neural activity that somehow bear some interesting relation to the things out there. So, you know, right now in my visual cortex, I've got some pattern of neurons firing that has some interesting relation to the water bottle. And because I'm feeling thirsty, the brain can then use that model or representation of the water bottle to issue motor commands and get me to come over here and pick it up and have a drink. So I don't know if that actually made it clearer or more complicated, but yeah, a representation, mental representation, just an internal state of the system that the system is using as a proxy for things that it needs to behave intelligently with respect to. And for the philosophers of mind in the room, I'm a narrow representationalist, so I don't think that phenomenal character supervenes on wide content. I think it supervenes on narrow content, in other words, intrinsic properties of the organism. And so the general picture of the mind I have is very similar to what classically in Western philosophy was known as indirect realism, so the view you get in Locke and people like this, and nowadays is undergoing a sort of revival in cognitive neuroscience as the controlled hallucination view of conscious experience, as they call it. So it's the idea...
Where do you put instinct in here? I'm not familiar with this model. I mean, I'm thinking, of course, of Freud's death instinct.
Sure.
He wrote about Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Yeah.
Illustrated very simply when we stand towards the edge of a balcony, you know, we always look for a moment and think we can jump. You know?
Yeah.
The idea that we have a proclivity to think about death because of that. So where does that fit in the cognitive framework?
It's...
He called it an instinct or a drive, so it's not just a kind of sort of thought that comes up.
Okay, yeah, good. So I'm glad you asked. So sometimes when people here talk about mental representations and representationalism, they think about representations in this very narrow sense as being language-like structures. I'm using it in a broader sense than that, right? So on my representationalist view of the mind, and this is going to come up, this is a central part of the whole kind of project here, is there may be many different kinds of representations in different formats. Some of them might be more language-like, some of them might be more structural, map-like, pictorial, being generated by different systems within the mind and brain.
And there's also the longitudinal thing, because when people are actually confronted with death, when there's no way out, the fear of it changes substantially. So they either go into action or they come to grips with what's going to happen to them. So where does that fit into the fear? Because it's a sliding scale. I mean, if you're lying in bed at night and all of a sudden you think, my God, I'm going to die one day, that's one thing. But if you're actually said, look, you're going to die, then the change is major. Where does that fit into the framework? I'm sorry for interrupting you now.
No, that's fine.
The missing part of the instinct really grabbed me.
So so where it fits into this general representationalist framework is, this is just a broad, like, meta theory, if you like, for how we think about the mind. It's just the idea that the mind is a representational system. It is a system that operates by generating these internal states that serve as proxies for things in the world and then manipulating those states. And that bare idea is compatible with a whole lot of different theories about the specific architecture and organization of the mind. So a representationalist approach like this is definitely compatible with all kinds of psychodynamic theories of that kind. It's sort of neutral with respect to them.
But can you just say that some representations are evolved in the sense that we come with predispositions for certain representations, and those are evolutionarily ingrained, and those look like impulses or instincts in the sense that the representation action loop is sort of immediate and consistent among people. But at some point that representational capacity was gained in the evolutionary trajectory.
Yeah, that's right. So it's consistent with a broad representationalism to think that some of these representational processes and tendencies are innate, are evolved, and that some of them might be very low level. I mean, in fact, it's orthodoxy in this sort of view to think there's a hell of a lot of unconscious representational activity as well. So
right, and to have an instinct towards something presumes that you've represented that thing, and you're representing the thing and your beliefs about that thing. And if you represent the thing, then you have a belief about it, which would be like an instinctual response. And this is
makes sense.
yeah.
But it's a priori. I mean, it has to exist just the way the Buddha nature exists.
Right. What was the first prior? Yeah, this is a.
But
So
you're talking about a particular kind of model of cognitive science, which is.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is it's sort of, at least on some views, the foundational assumption of cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience. You will get people today who dispute this, but traditionally the idea has been what distinguishes cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience from other approaches to the mind is this sort of basic representationalist approach, the idea that the mind-brain is to be understood as a representational system, but then that as a meta-theoretical commitment is consistent with a whole bunch of different substantive theories about what kinds of representations are there in there, how are they being generated, how are they being processed, how are they interacting.
Would this fall into empirical work then? Would you do it as well?
This is, a founding assumption of cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, which are empirical disciplines, but yeah, I mean, research in those fields, empirical research, experimental research, typically proceeds on the basis of and is guided by these sorts of theoretical assumptions. Yeah. Although, as I say, nowadays there are dissenters. There are people who say you can have cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience that isn't founded on a representational approach. That's where you hear about things like enactivism, embodied cognition, this sort of stuff. But I'm old-fashioned. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool representationalist. And we can talk about that in Q&A if people want to question that. But so this is pretty much where I'm coming from. And yeah, so the idea is that the brain is a representational system, and a lot of that representational activity is unconscious, but then some of it is conscious, and every conscious experience we have, according to this approach, is ultimately identical to some kind of representational state going on in there. So an example that a lot of people like to use is you hear a sentence in your native language, right? And there are all these, you can immediately tell whether it's grammatical or not. You know, you get this feeling of rightness or wrongness. And so there are complex computational representational processes going on in your brain, parsing the grammar of the sentence and working out, does it follow the rules or not? They're totally unconscious, right? You have no awareness of those complex processes at all. What you do experience, what you have an awareness of, is just the feeling of that's right or that's wrong. You know, the feeling, the sense of grammaticality or ungrammaticality. So that's the distinction, if you like, between unconscious representational activity, that's all the parsing and syntactic analysis and whatever, and then the thought would be that conscious experience you have, the feeling that, oh, that sounds right or that doesn't sound right, that's also the result of some kind of representational activity. The brain has generated a representation that says that's right or that's wrong, that's grammatical or that's ungrammatical. So look, I hope this is clear enough. I did think in the last day or two that I should probably expand this bit of the talk a bit because I am relying on a whole lot of assumptions, but I'll just assume that's clear enough for now, and we can look at more aspects of it in question time if people want. So, why, from this representationalist point of view, do I think that the expectation of nothingness, eon as I'll now call it, is not just representationally interesting but representationally puzzling? Well, certain assumptions about how human self-representation works, in other words, how the brain represents the self, and how these relate to self-consciousness, in other words, our experience of the self, our phenomenology of being a self or being an I. So one question we might ask is, why is this experience relatively rare, right? Why does it seem to happen so seldom? I mean, possibly some people didn't want to fess up, but in a room of, 15 odd people, 3 or 4 or 5 said, yes, I've experienced it. So why is everyone else not experiencing it? And even those of us who have, why are we not experiencing it most of the time? Well, I'm influenced here, as elsewhere, heavily by the work of Thomas Metzinger, who's done a lot of work in the representationalist, neurophilosophical philosophy of cognitive science sort of tradition on the nature of self-representation, how the brain represents itself and how that relates to self-consciousness. And Metzinger embraces the no-self view, anti-realism about the self. He says nobody ever was or had a self. No such things as selves exist in the world. And it's a very Buddhist view. It's one that's familiar to everyone here. Metzinger has been defending this view in the context of modern philosophy of mind, cognitive science, neurophilosophy. But he asks this very interesting question, which is, why is this view counterintuitive, right? And why will it always remain counterintuitive, supposing that it is in fact a philosophically very plausible, perhaps even correct view? And the core of his answer is that it's features of the representational system that is the human mind, the way the human mind is wired up to represent the self, sort of makes it very difficult for us to take anti-realism about the self seriously. And so it gets a bit more specific. He says, well, what happens when you try to entertain the no-self view? Well, you try and generate a mental model, a kind of conscious simulation or experience of a world in which no selves exist, right? When you try and grasp the view, understand what it means, you try and generate this mental model of a selfless world or a selfless reality. And he says the very attempt is self-defeating because by trying to do anything, you're engaging in some kind of effort, you're engaging in an act, and then the brain, because you've done that, the brain represents you as a self. That very act of deliberately trying to do anything is something that the brain, internally monitors and says, oh yeah, we're making an effort, we're deliberately trying to create this particular state of mind, therefore there's a self. This is one of the bases, according to Metzinger, on which the brain represents the existence of a self, is there are all these volitional actions that happen, right? And they might be overt behavioral actions, walking, reaching for the bottle, but they also could be internal mental actions, trying to think certain thoughts, trying to imagine certain possibilities. But his idea is anytime we have any kind of volitional act, whether it's overt or internal, that's one of the things that makes the brain say, oh, there's an entity here, there's an I, there's a self, because there must be someone who's doing the doing, right? There must be some entity responsible for this deliberate action, whatever it is. So this is the kind of answer, because I buy into a lot of Metzinger's assumptions and his general picture, this is the kind of answer that I think you have to give. I think if you ask why aren't most of us, most of the time, able to understand that we are going to die in this seemingly very vivid, very deep kind of way, it has to be something to do with the human self-model, the kind of architecture of self-representation, the way in which the brain represents the existence of a self that prevents us from really grasping in this distinctive way the fact that this self is going to become nothing, is going to cease to exist. Now, Metzinger says there can be totally selfless phenomenal states, right? So he's not saying that you can't have a conscious experience with no sense of self. He's just saying that when you deliberately try and entertain one, it's not going to work because that involves a deliberate act, an act of will or volition, and that automatically cues the brain into representing a self. So he says you can have, these minimal phenomenal experiences, these MPE states that we've been hearing about from various people. You can have states of ego dissolution under psychedelics in meditation, but they can't be entered deliberately, they can't be entered voluntarily. Anytime you try to enter a state of this kind, that amounts to selfing. Well, so that's fine, right? What's the problem? Eon, the expectation of nothingness, isn't entered voluntarily, so it seems like there's no real issue here. Well, that's true, but the issue is slightly different, right? The issue is, I think, if we ask from this representationalist standpoint what ordinarily prevents the occurrence of eon, it has to be some aspect of the process of self-modeling that Metzinger has analysed and described in detail. And in particular, he says things like this: we experience the self not only as real, but as something of which it is not possible that it could not exist. we confuse the apparent phenomenal necessity of the self with metaphysical necessity. So because we, in the ordinary course of things, don't have experiences lacking a sense of self, to us subjectively it always seems as though I am present in my experiences, having my experiences. We mistake this for some kind of necessity on a kind of deep, maybe semi-conscious level. We make this inference that because I have always been here and I am always here, I will always be here. We sort of have this sense that the self is a necessary being or a necessary entity, something that could not possibly not exist. But again, it sort of seems okay, right? Because you could just say, well, this process of self-modeling or self-representation that Metzinger has analysed, it gets disrupted somehow, right? Something happens to disrupt that process, like can happen in meditation or spontaneous mystical states or psychedelic experiences, and so then this kind of representation, this mental model of a necessarily existent self just goes away, and then we're able to grasp the fact that this thing is one day going to disappear into nothingness.
You've got about 15 left, you said.
In the total session?
15 to 20.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'll try and get to the point. So the problem as I see it is that by all accounts, so the proposal, the initially promising idea is, okay, well, it happens when self-modeling gets disrupted, when this process of self-representation somehow is down-regulated or goes offline to some extent. The problem with that approach, it seems to me, is that by all accounts, the expectation of nothingness is a state of intensified, not diminished self-consciousness, right? How can this state result from a diminution in the brain's activity of self-modeling when what happens in this state is we become acutely, intensely aware? I mean, what else is the fear about? What else is the terror about if it's not about becoming acutely aware of this thing that is going to cease to exist, this thing that is going to disappear forever? So it seems to me that when you kind of buy into all of my assumptions and have a look at the phenomenology of this state, you get this seemingly inconsistent dyad, this pair of propositions, each of which seems plausible but which don't seem like they can both be true. And the first one is that eon is a state in which self-representation is attenuated or down-regulated significantly. Why should you accept that? Well, it seems like we have to explain how the phenomenon comes about, right? How could it come about? How could you have this sort of experience without these ordinary processes of self-representation that plausibly prevent its occurrence being sort of put out of action or diminished somehow? On the other hand, it's a state in which self-representation is enhanced or increased or upregulated significantly. Why would you buy that? Well, how else do we explain this phenomenology of intensified self-consciousness? It's not an experience of selflessness, it's an experience of intense awareness of the self as a thing that is going to end. So that's the thing that has been puzzling me. Part 3 is where I try and say something sensible about possible answers. Probably good that I don't have enough time to really go through this material in detail. I'll just skim over it in a very broad brush way. So one way you could go, of course, is you could reject the whole Metzinger picture I buy into of self-representation and self-modeling and as the thing that underpins human self-consciousness. I don't personally think there's a plausible alternative within the representationalist approach to the broad sort of approach that Metzinger has. You could actually reject the whole representationalist approach too. I don't think there's a plausible alternative to that either. We may disagree on some of these points. So when you look at these dissonance cases in general, these cases where you intellectually believe one thing but experience the world a different way, the standard solution in philosophy, I mean, these sorts of cases have been discussed a lot in the last 10 or 20 years, and the standard solution is to posit two distinct types of mental states, or propositional attitudes as they're called. So you get Tamar Gendler's idea of A-leaf and B-leaf. You know, B-leafs are one type of mental state, A-leafs are another type, and so it's no problem that we can have a B-leaf and then an A-leaf that's inconsistent with it. That's fine. And then you get other sort of distinctions along the same lines. So Eric Schwitzgable talks about beliefs and in-between beliefs. My friend Miri talks about action-based beliefs. Keith Frankish and others in relation to the dual system theory talk about type 1 and type 2 beliefs. Now my feeling, and I'm open to being wrong on this, is that these proposals generally are too high level and coarse grained to really speak to the cognitive computational question. They're just kind of grouping mental states into two distinct types, but they're not really saying at the level of representations and cognitive processes what is the actual difference between, you know, A leafs and B leafs, or type 1 and type 2 beliefs. I think that what we have to buy into, and this is probably not going to make much sense to anyone who's not a philosopher of mind or cognitive science, I don't have time to unpack the jargon, but I think we have to buy into the idea that the brain subdoxastically represents an ontology, right? So doxastic means relating to belief, so I think we have to buy into the idea that we've got our explicit beliefs about how the world is, and then we've got our perceptual experiences, and then there's something in between. There's some other kind of cognitive state, representational state, that is distinct from our introspectable, reportable beliefs, the beliefs that we can reflect on and tell each other about, and our perceptual experiences, because it's a truism, basically, that our reflective ontological convictions, our explicit beliefs about what exists, often come apart from our experiences of what exists. You know, we have these ontic experiences, these experiences of certain things as existing or not existing, that can be inconsistent with our explicit theoretical beliefs about what exists. But my feeling is that this hasn't, the implications of this haven't really been appreciated for cognitive theory and for theories of cognitive architecture in cognitive science. And so cognitive science people, cognitive neuroscience people who are interested, let's try and talk about this later, because I think that two really influential theories of cognitive processing both have trouble accounting for this idea. Both predictive processing and the modularity of mind view, it's not obvious how they can explain this. And so I hope that intrigues some of you enough to want to talk to me about it later, because I think I have to stop at this point. So yeah, very open to any ideas for directions I should look in, why the problem isn't a problem, possible solutions, and so on.
Just to start, since you're asking for direction, so you had this why is Eon rare on one of your slides. So there's a field called terror management, which is this guy Sheldon Solomon. He has a great book called The Worm at the Core, and the worm at the core is William James's expression for this terror of death. And the idea is that it's not rare at all. Everybody has it, but usually it gets displaced or sublimated into things like buying cars, having sex, creating art, so it's always happening. So the possibility is that when you're lying in bed at night, that's the time when it's not being displaced elsewhere. And if you had some displacement thing, it wouldn't arise. So that book is a good thing to look into, and they give loads of studies, and it's kind of quite experimental as a psychologist. So it's a great book to read on that. The other thing is as well, so we sleep every night, and of course it's kind of like a death every night. I mean, how does that sort of work into this?
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, I think the naive answer is just that, you know, we go to sleep believing we're going to wake up. But I mean, I've actually had experiences, to continue being a bit autobiographical, of delving into altered states and so on, and actually having, you know, a certain kind of insomnia resulting that actually is a fear of disintegrating into sleep. So I think the same thing can happen. Yeah.
Paul.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. I just want to get your thoughts on a slightly different way of putting the object of dread, right? And I'll do it by way of an anecdote that I learned from an acquaintance of mine who works at a university and is a friend of a person who was at one stage a very famous anthropologist named Marshall Salins. And Robert's story was coming, Marshall Salins coming out of the library, and Marshall said to him, "I've just experienced my own death." And he said, "Well, what's that?" He was doing the usual reporting of research type of activity, and he had to put in his citations, and his once huge citations had been declining over the years, and now they had flatlined, right? Now, I don't know how Marshall Salins took this, but my friend Robert said it with a definite sense of dread, right? And he said something like, "Oh, it's going to happen to all of us, Paul." I mean, you know, Robert's sort of a person who hit the sort of heights of his realm. He's a sort of Guggenheim Fellow and all this sort of stuff. So, you know, the idea of non-recognition, I think, can maybe, I mean, you know, sort of, can be maybe even more overwhelming, the idea of being dead.
Yeah.
I mean, non-recognition, no, you're a nobody, right? You're a nobody. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody loves you, right? I mean, you know, nobody remembers you with love and those sort of things. That seems to, just sort of introspectively, I mean, that is pretty horrific, that thought, to me. I don't mean not being famous, I mean, you know, just
Not being cited.
not being recognised as a human being.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, maybe on the level of dread, that is somewhere in the vicinity of death. Or, you know.
Yeah, no, that's good, thanks. I mean, I think there are ways you can think about this, because I have my own ideas about self-modelling and how it works that are very similar to Thomas Metzinger's, but I think that, you know, we do represent certain properties as being more and less essential to ourselves, right? And so possibly that for all humans or most humans, some version of being recognised is very close to the core. It's one of the things that is represented as being a very essential property of this thing, such that if that went away...
That's a very Hegelian view, right? Self-consciousness is dependent on recognition.
Right. Yeah, I mean, but this would be a slightly different idea. It would be like the model that each of us has of the thing that we are represents being recognised as one of the essential properties of that thing. So it's not that it's you know, being recognised as an essential property of self-representation, but that we represent being recognised as an essential property of the self. And so then contemplating no longer being recognised is tantamount to contemplating the non-existence of that thing. And I guess what I think happens in cases like this, I think they are structurally similar to all sorts of cases like that. We contemplate losing some essential property or some property that we are modelling as essential to me, and that is tantamount to contemplating the non-existence of me. But in this case, the property is existence or having experience or something like that, and so it gets right to the core. It's like the most essential property or something. Yeah, thanks.
I had, is this on the same point or is it a different point?
It's all one, mate.
No, it's not in the context of questions, probably.
Really cool stuff and great topic to be thinking about. I'm wondering how you mentioned type 1 and type 2, and I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, like just in cognitive science, you have all Kahnemans like system 1, system 2, type 1 processes, type 2 processes.
That's where that
intuition
comes
versus
from.
Analysis.
Yeah.
This whole thing, and so was that basically what you're pointing to as one possible explanation, and saying that you need something like that within predictive processing or these sorts of models?
It seems that way to me. So if you like predictive processing, there are two issues here, right? One is just the general question of different representational formats, and this is something that people have started to talk about more, and there's nothing in predictive processing to say you can't have different representational formats or codes or whatever, like plausibly you do, but just the details of that need to be worked out. And to my mind, it's interesting if we've got, if you know, the phenomenology warrants an inference that we've got one kind of representational format going on right up the top at the level of explicit beliefs, and then a different one somewhere in the middle modelling this ontology that we actually experience. The other thing, which is more about overall architecture, is how do you get the stable dissonance? So this is something I didn't get a chance to talk about, but people just recently have been asking in relation to PP, how do you get things like this, right? Because it's supposed to be this great big seamless hierarchy where everything is cognitively penetrable, so how do you get things like this persisting in the face of beliefs to the contrary? Yeah. And Chiara Caparucio and co have got a paper out just this year where they say, look, you know, you might have priors built into the perceptual system in the form of anatomical constraints, which is a cool idea, but doesn't seem applicable to this kind of thing. Right. So the thought is, if you're into PP, it's kind of puzzling how you get these ubiquitous and persistent dissonances between explicit reflective conviction and then ontic experience, as I'm calling it.
It is a very interesting question, and how to answer it, I'm not sure exactly, but to me it seems intuitive. When you think about this hierarchy of processing levels that are trying to cohere, but I can somehow, my gut feeling is that it makes a lot of sense that low-level processes can, over multiple layers of abstraction, become discoherent through this sort of whispers approach. They're just so far separated from each other, and to me, that's one of the things I find appealing about this sort of hierarchy of abstraction. It explains all the weird dissonances and cognitive and suffering that people undergo because you have these high levels, low levels, and you can take in all of these unconscious sufferings, and a lot of that representational process is happening unconsciously and automatically, and the separation comes out naturally. But anyway, I think you're right that it needs to be worked out in way more detail.
Well, and the interesting thing about that, because I agree with what you just said, and then it's interesting that you get psychedelics increasing crosstalk between all these different systems and whatever. But the interesting thing is, I mean, how low level is the form of self-modeling that underpins our experience of self as necessary? Do you know what I mean? It doesn't, in the way we usually think about the predictive processing scheme, that seems like a really high level thing, like really abstract, invariant prior, not something sitting down in the visual system or whatever. So how does that stay so incoherent from our also very high level explicit beliefs about the self?
Right,
Do you know what I mean?
For some reason, in our sort of thinking about this, there's multiple levels to the self, and I think there's low-level invariant features as well, but that's probably not what it's going into now. But what I did want to, also with the psychedelics point, also in the insight meditation stages, which you're probably familiar with, but there's one stage, I don't remember the name, but it's this basically, this deep existential dread appears at a certain stage of the path sort of reliably, and when you talk to Vipassana meditators, this is like an important stage to be looking out for because it's volatile, and there's deep existential dread and possibly disgust and all of these like wacky, heavy aversion experiences.
Yeah, I've been looking for all these excuses to stop doing my practice for the last year or so, interestingly.
Which is precisely when the teacher will come and say, no, now you really need to keep going. But there's one person, Henk Barendrecht, who's a professor of mathematics who we do a lot of our studies with, but he's also a Vipassana and a teacher in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition. He's written papers about this stage in particular, and he says that is the most fundamental thing that the meditation experience of like, let's say, stream entry releases permanently, is this existential dread. But that's the key thing that is broken out of when one of these awakenings sort of happen.
Can you send me
Yeah,
those papers? Yeah, thanks. I didn't get the name, but if you can make a note to send them to me, that'd be great. Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the right person to comment on this because I've never had this experience. But here's an observation, make of it what you will. Maybe the Metzinger story is part of the answer. I don't have a horse in that race. But if it is, it can't be the whole answer. Simply because there's an obvious asymmetry here between experiencing the time after your death and experiencing the time before your birth. Okay? If you're right about the experience, it's an experience people have about the future, but not about the past. Yet the Metzinger point is symmetric.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's
so
good.
There's something about the direction of time that's going on here.
Yeah.
And I have no idea what it is, but the most sophisticated discussion of the direction of time, specifically with respect to death, is in Division 2 of Sein and Zeit, being and nothingness. And I'm not telling you you're going to find the answer there, but that's one place I'd go and look.
You're telling me what I have already been realizing for a while, which is compounding my existential dread, which is that I need to read Heidegger. Sorry, which section was it?
Part 2.
Part 2.
Part 3 was never written.
Okay.
So you could read my book, which is 100 pages long, which does similar things.
That sounds better. No, that's great. Thanks, Graham. That's a really good point.
That's better published.
Thanks, Chris, that was fantastic.
Thanks.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
It was not the most depressing. Anyway, it's more of a comment around a whole area of things, and I guess one thing that I would be doing if I were working on this is trying to get clear and more precise on the target phenomenon itself.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to, so I guess the way to summarize up what I'll say next is kind of to think about to what extent the experience of dread and anxiety that seemed quite central to all of the quotations that you had and also to the description is really both essential and also kind of unique to the anticipation of no longer being oneself.
Yeah.
So I guess one side of this that I would be coming at from is firstly trying to separate out kind of the anticipation of the experience of dying, which I personally find quite terrifying. Like, what is the process that is going to transform me into nothing? That's the one I'm terrified of.
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever comes after, I don't care that much because in my view, I'm just not there.
Yeah, yeah.
Done, right?
That's definitely
So,
different from this, yeah.
It is, but I think often in those phenomenological descriptions, it will probably be bound up with each other. And I think that probably goes back to Graham's comment as well on the asymmetry, is that if we imagine it as a time before our birth, that part of the dread is more easily quarantined. So I kind of suspect that in many cases, that will be infiltrating, that will be part of the dread.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And another thing.
Oh,
that's-
the process of, I don't think
Yeah.
it is, to be honest. I don't think that's what the dread is about at all.
That's possible, but.
It's, yeah, yeah. No, sure.
I haven't experienced the dread of the nothingness itself.
I'm just
so
thumping
it
the
could
table
be-
phenomenologically here, yeah.
Yeah, it could be the case that in some cases it is and in some cases it isn't.
Yeah,
But it could
yeah.
also be interesting to then look, and this kind of came up in the comment on sleep and the dissolution of self in sleep, and of course we also get the dissolution of self in psychedelics and meditation and so on and so forth, and how that has been related theoretically to the experience of being dead and of dying.
Yes.
So one thing I'd be looking at, if you haven't yet, is the Evan Thompson stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I thought was quite, so he's got stuff in Waking, Dreaming, Being is the book, and he's also got a chapter on the transformative experience of dying. So he has a
Yeah.
chapter on that, which also kind of ties him back via L.A. Paul with the Mary examples
Yeah.
in an indirect way. But I mean, there is also this whole tradition of kind of using, the experience of the clear light of sleep and the clear light of dreaming as a kind of preparatory stage for facing the fact of one's death.
Yes.
So that would also be something. And as a side note to that, I can also try and get this to you. There was this, do you know Patient AZ? This is totally jumping around between different things.
Not
Who
sure.
was you do, the Phantom Limb patient investigated by Katoomba, who is really famous for having had all of these really vivid phantom limbs from birth.
Don't know if I do know this one.
Anyway, I'll mention that to you separately. She kind of used lucid dreaming to prepare for her own death because she was also terminally ill, and that came also out of a meditation, a very long meditation practice. I'm not sure in what tradition, but
Wow.
I think there's a book on that.
Cool.
So that might be something as well. And the other thing, and I'll shut up here, that I wanted to get to, so I guess on the one hand, there's this question, is the dread and the anxiety really bound up with the representation, the anticipation of nothingness versus how we get there?
Yes.
But I think the other side of this that is often missed, in my view, in philosophical discussions of death, is that they're very focused on ourselves, right? So they're very focused on the anticipation of my own death versus that of others that are close to me. And there's very little debate. I mean, there's a growing philosophical debate on grief, but there's really not that much on it by comparison. So I think that could also be something to take on board.
Yeah, interesting.
And likewise, kind of the anticipation of how one's own death will impact others. So I think those are all things where one might find parallels and where one might find that there might be aspects of the representation of one's own death and nothingness might not be unique to one's own case, but that actually they might be bound up with the anticipation of other loved ones dying and potentially having to undergo that.
So this is interesting.
So that,
Yeah.
sorry for that whole rambling.
No, that's all great. Thanks. I mean, interestingly, my intuition is that looking at those kinds of cases is more useful for a contrast than a comparison, because in my experience, and I think that of many people who have this experience, what is so often emphasized about it is precisely its distinctness from all these other things, right? So it seems to be this very sharp thing that it's kind of like, it's not about the suffering of dying, it's not about harm in a deprivationist sense, it's not about how it will affect other people, it's not about all these things, it's about this thing, me, that has the experiences, stopping existing forever. So yeah, I mean, looking at all that stuff could be really useful in terms of actually like narrowing down the region of state space where this sits. Yeah, that's great, thanks.
But maybe also thinking about who does and who does not have it. Like, I'm also, I think, a bad person because I have not had it, and my intuition, my gut, which doesn't really count for anything, but my gut feeling would be that all of the terror is all of the other things that I mentioned. I find them much more terrifying. But that could be because I haven't understood the target.
I've had lots of conversations with people who haven't had this experience, and this is how they always go. The person who hasn't had the experience says, no, it must be this or this or this or this or this that you're afraid of, and I say, no, it's this. It's this other thing that's not any of those things. So it's very interesting.
I think there's a gender difference about men, more narcissistic. I want to keep going because damn, we're brilliant.
Could be.
Okay, we've got lots of questions waiting, but we'll save them for lunch because it's kind of running. Thanks again, Chris.
Just before I'll save my thoughts quickly before they disappear.
Please.
So I might be with Dean a little bit on like the eons are happening all the time, and it's the denial of death phenomenon. You know that book, The Denial of Death.
Yeah.
For me, the experience exactly as you described, involuntary, came from outside. I've never had a mystical experience, but this is the closest I've come to a mystical experience. As it was happening for those 2 or 3 weeks of